Beyond the DAW, fixing the structural flaws in digital music tools, why MIDI and DAWs still trap us in outdated piano-shaped thinking. In a prior presentation, we looked at the pros and cons of the default for writing down and reading musical information, musical ideas, songs, tunes, melodies, that of course being sheet music. Sheet music at one point in time being the default for writing down information using the musical computer of the time, that being the piano. At this point in time, in some circles, sheet music is still the default, and if you can't read and write sheet music, you're not really thought of as a full-fledged musician. However, that is changing due in part to the DAWs and the MIDI tools that we have at this point in time. However, even these tools are still adopted to the sheet music and have some of the same flaws within them. We need to take a step beyond that and make a better system which isn't restricted by some of these problems that are still haunting the current system. That's what we'll look at this time, the flaws, the things that we can improve upon in the modern tools for writing down this information. Now, obviously, when we're thinking about the sheet music, remember the major idea of that is that we wanted to write it down in such a way that we can have multiple people playing at the same point in time, like an orchestra, for example, and the person that is writing this information down is using the computer of the time for music, which is the piano. Therefore, the sheet music is reflecting, in essence, the structure of the piano. That's where the sharps and flats come from. That's where the natural notes come from, and so on and so forth. When we move into a DAW system, you don't need some of that baggage that comes with the piano, because now the system that we use should be with the musical tool of the computer. We don't have to really think of the piano as the musical tool. So the baggage that comes with the piano, and there is baggage with the piano, even though it's a beautiful instrument, is something that we can let go of if we're not a piano player and we're working in a DAW system from just strictly a music theory side of things. The instrument should not be driving the music theory unless it's music theory for that particular instrument. The piano was the computer of its time for music. It's no longer the case. So DAWs were a huge step forward, but not the end. They let you compose, produce, and automate. Great for sequencing and auto manipulation, standard for modern music production, but still fundamentally based on piano-centric note stacking and linear symbol thinking. So some of the symbols within the DAW are going to be a little bit more straightforward because you're going to have just basically a standard grid, in essence, a spreadsheet. You might as well be working in Excel, but you still have this kind of note stacking system that is taking place, and we're still using some of the terminology that has been adopted or was created because of the tool of the piano, which is actually hurting modern musicians more than helping them. So the core problem, DAW and MIDI still have these flaws. So as we currently look at the DAW system and the MIDI system, these are flaws, most of which are also in the sheet music. So we could still use the DAW basically to write down our musical ideas, be able to read them, as well as play them back, beautiful, but they could be better. So the piano roll layout, it still stacks chords. Now, chord stacking isn't a huge problem because we might want to visualize our information in that way, meaning we have 12 different rows for one octave of information. However, that's also going to be quite cluttered if we have all those rows that are going to be representing one octave of information, and people that aren't as good at music theory may not be able to visualize chords as easily if they had some other default way to be putting in default chords. Octaves are spread vertically instead of row-based. So input, we have the piano. So that's another huge issue in that if you work in a MIDI system, you could use your mouse to write musical ideas down. Now remember, if you're in a sheet music setting back in the day, you'd be writing your information down most likely and playing it on the piano where you have two hands that you can basically play a melody and possibly chords at the same time and then write that information down. How does things work today? Well, you're going to write the information down in the DAW, but as you do it, you can play it back automatically. So the fact that you have that ear play a lot better today without as much musical knowledge or information means that we can kind of move around the ideas a little bit more easily. We want to make the input as easy as possible to do that. If you use a mouse, it's slow. If you use a piano, however, that's plugged into the computer, you are introducing all the problems related to the piano, including the fact that you have all of the white keys are going to be called now the natural notes. You have, it looks like, from the shape of the piano, different distances between the notes, which aren't different distances. You're introducing problems to music theory that people that don't play the piano don't need to be introduced to. So it would be better to use actually the typewriter keyboard, or just like a calculator 10-key keyboard for the data input for people that aren't piano players. And that would be easier to do. You don't need another thing to input, and it would actually be functionally better for the instrument of the computer. Now, if you are a piano expert, then that would be great to still have the capacity to plug in the piano and play the piano into the system. But if you're not a piano player, and many people more and more these days that use the MIDI system are not, the piano is going to introduce more problems than it's going to solve. So no Nashville style relative input. In other words, we're just looking at a raw stack of notes, 12 notes in the musical alphabet stacked on top of each other as we go up multiple octaves. We don't have any relative positions, which means that it's not going to be easy to transpose that information to all 12 collections of 7 notes, or to rotate that information through different modal perspectives. These are things that should be available in a modern MIDI or DAW system. Can't center chords modularly, must stack individual notes. So we have the stacking, transposing, and rotating modes is manual, not automatic. Now this is amazing, because if you're going to put this stuff into a computer, the beauty of the computer is the fact that you should be able to tweak it. You should be able to tinker with it in the computer much more easily than you could if you were writing it by hand. It's like the difference than if you were using the old spreadsheet on a piece of paper, a green piece of paper, grid paper, versus putting stuff into Excel, where now you can move things around automatically and automate formulas and whatnot. So we're still putting stuff into the DAW system, but we haven't made it so that you can move things around in a way that's musical, that just makes sense from a normal kind of Western music system, which means that you should have 2 dials, that anything you write in the system, you should be able to tell the system, this is the perspective that I'm writing this music from. Is it the perspective of the C major scale, the D major scale, or this collection of notes? And this is the tonic that I'm giving as the tonic of this collection of notes. That gives you relative position, allowing you to automatically shift all your information through all 12 collections of notes, as well as rotate that information to all the modal perspectives. This is something that should be there in current DAWs. So chords still stack, just like sheet music. Vertical stacking clutters the grid. So you have something that looks kind of like this, right? You got the notes that are going to basically be stacked up on top of each other, which for a complex song is going to get very messy very quickly. So every chord must be built note by note. No clean way to label or modularize, meaning you look at it from a modal standpoint. Impossible to see the shape of the chord. It's going to be very cluttered. Now you can kind of visualize the shape of the chord, but it's going to be, a lot uglier to see when you're going to have a lot of information. It's hard to say that chord is a C major or something. Complex voicing looks scattered dots, so it's going to be a very messy situation. So here's an example just in Excel, for example, and this red bit represents 1 octave of information. I'm looking at it from the perspective of the 12 note collection around C major. So C going up in pitch up to B, and then it starts over at C again and goes up. Now notice that these 3 notes stacked within 1 octave most likely represent a chord, meaning it's a C major chord. But if I was to look at that, particularly if I don't know music theory, I'm not going to be able to visualize that as a C major chord, right? I might have been able to use a tool to say, hey, put in this place a C major chord, and then it stacked it for me. That's cool. But once I've written my entire song, I'm not going to be able to see that if I'm not a music professional, if I don't really understand the chord names, to say, oh, I'm going from C major, and then this is going to a D major, a D minor 7 that we've added here, and now I'm going to an E, minor 9, right? I'm not going to be able to see that normally, and a lot of people that use the software are not adept enough to understand the naming convention of the chords. So it would be nice if you can scrunch this down to one horizontal row, which we'll talk about. Octaves are vertical, not modular. So one octave should be one row. So what I could do is take that information and put it on one row, kind of like if you had tablature, or say you're writing a song and you just want to know the chords, and you just write the chords above the note, the song, the words in the song. That's kind of like having the chords, which are 3 notes each at least, that are right above the song, meaning they're represented on one row. You should be able to do that whether you're writing chords or singular notes. Scrunch down everything into one row of information if you want to view it that way. So DAWs display pitch vertically over many rows, meaning the pitch is on the y-axis or the vertical axis, time on the x-axis. So an octave spans multiple rows. So when we go octaves up, it's going to be very long. No single place to see C through B as one visual unit. So it makes pattern recognition harder. So in other words, this whole thing is representing one octave, this red bit right here. It would be nice if I can scrunch it down to something like this. Now this orange bit in the middle is the same data as this bit whole here, this whole thing. Just this middle row, not this one or this one, just the orange row represents that. Now I've written the chords in an unconventional way because I'm writing the chords without referencing the note names, which makes it transferable. You could write the chords any way you want. A DAW should be able to say, hey look, this is a 3-note Ionian chord, or a 3-note Nashville number 1 chord, or a C major chord if I'm in the collection of notes of the C major. But if I was in the collection of notes of D major, then this would be a D major. It would still be an Ionian 3-note chord, but a D major chord. And if I write it this way, notice how much nicer it would be able to visualize the information. Now, if I write a chord, I can write the normal chords. And if I write one note, I could write it by the notes from C up to B in pitch in one octave. But I can also write it with relative Nashville numbers, which makes more sense for people that don't play the piano, right? Because you could just say, hey, look, choose the collection of notes that you're going to be playing in. It's going to be a 7-note collection, and you can choose 1 through 12 collections based on the major key. You could also say those collections of notes from the perspective of the modes, but as a rule, choose the collection of notes based on the major key, and then tell us what your tonic is, like the Ionian. If you do that, then you can just play your song on a 10 key, like a calculator, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are your notes, and then you have 5 notes, which could be a 0.5 or representing some other key on the keyboard to represent the 5 notes that are outside the collection. So all 12 collections of notes can be represented with these same numbers, which are 12 numbers, but 7 numbers that are inside the 7-note collection. And that would be the idea. And then, of course, you could also change the modal perspective, saying, I want to play the 2 as the tonic. That's fine. If the 2 is the tonic and you're still looking at the collection of notes around C major, meaning you're playing in a Dorian mode, then the bass line of this octave that you're playing in will not be at C, but start at D. So you should be able to go back and forth between this layout and this layout, and you should be able to see this layout in terms of notes if you want to, or in terms of numbers, and be able to view the chords from the perspective of relative chord position or traditional chord names. A modern DAW should be able to do all of those options. So input still limits the piano. So piano uses a UI, so the MIDI keyboard is dominant. So meaning if you want to do a faster data input into a DAW or a MIDI system, it's still going to default to a keyboard. Look at the keyboard. It's uneven. It doesn't represent the actual distance of notes. It's a beautiful instrument, but it shouldn't be the default for people that don't play the piano, right? We can assign the keys on a normal typewriter that would be better. That would be easier. I could just assign the keys. Look, this is 1 through 7, and over here are the 5 notes that are not in the collection, or use the 10 key that would be up top in the numbers, and that would be pretty clear. So you could use the letters if you want to, or you can use the numbers. Again, you should have options to toggle between those different options within a modern MIDI system. So even computer keyboard defaults to the piano-shaped mapping, so reinforces shapes sharp and flat. Now remember, this sharps and flats only kind of make any kind of sense on a piano because it tells you the difference if you're playing each of the 12 collections of notes, because it's different on the piano because of the shapes of the key. But it's not different in a DAW system. There's no reason to have sharps and flats in a DAW system because we don't have any differences in actual distance between pitches. So the piano is going to just confuse people from a pure, just what do you need to know from a music theory system so that you can play the instrument of the DAW. And so that's the problem. So why teach people an outdated instrument layout when they're using a DAW? So again, I'm not putting down the piano. People should learn the piano. It's an efficient musical instrument, still allows you to play in 2 hands better than any other instrument, but it's not symmetrical. So it leads to a lot of problems. So if someone's not using the piano, more and more people aren't using the piano, don't know the piano, didn't learn traditional piano understanding. You don't need it to do the DAW. It's gonna cause you more problems than it's gonna help. So we need 10 key typing interface, meaning you could just use a calculator type or the 10 key on the typewriter. So forget the keyboard, use the keys. So you could use something like let users input 1, 3, 5 for a major triad, or we should be able to just map in the major triad as saying it's a 3-note Ionian chord, or give me an Ionian or Nashville number 1 3-note chord that should be able to represent it as a chord so that you can see it not as stacked notes once you're looking at your song. When you're reviewing your song, it would be nice to be able to recognize that as a chord. That's the C major chord. So, or an Ionian chord, or however you want to see it. The 1-4-7 suspended chord. So Nashville numbers are easier to learn, transpose, and visualize. So again, if you learned on a piano, people are going to resist this. You're going to know you have to learn the natural notes and all the sharps and flats and which keys have how many sharps and flats, but you don't in just plain theory on a DAW system, that's not the way, right? The simplest way to do it is to say, choose your 7-note collection out of the 12 7-note collections that we have. Doesn't mean that you can't play all 12 notes, but the perspective will be from 7 notes in the collection, 5 notes outside of the collection. We'll base it on the major scale, and then of those 7-note collections, which one is the tonic? That's going to tell you what mode you're in, and then from that point, you could just enter the data using 1 through 7, right, which are represent relative position, Ionian through Locrian, and that would be the simplest way, the most efficient way to enter on a computer, which is what more people are doing these days. So type music like math, not a piano. So instead of dragging things in and typing, in this vertical format, I should be able to play the DAW and it should give me this middle row, meaning I should be able to type on the 10 key, possibly type an N if I want to type a chord. So I would type an N3I or something like that in order to type a chord, or you can do the drop down to do the chords. But if I just want individual notes, I should be able to just type them with a 10 key or the numbers on the normal keyboard, or assign keys on the keyboard to represent the notes. If I want to play in Ionian, then the 1 should be the Ionian, the lowest note. If I want to play in Phrygian, then the 3 should be the lowest note. All I have to remember is the 3 is now the lowest note, and I'm going to go 3 through 7, right? So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the 1 and 2 will now be higher in pitch because the 3 is the tonic. So the middle row here does not represent middle C or C4 on the piano. It represents from the lowest pitch of the collection of notes that we have chosen to play in and 12 notes up. I should be able to go back and forth. So still trapped in 12 notes, not 7 relative. So DAWs think in chromatic steps, not contextual scales. So the MIDI notes are assigned with numbers. Now these numbers are great for background numbers. They're not really what we want to memorize as musicians. There would be a better number system for us to number, which would be like the Nashville numbers, or an absolute number for the notes starting from 0 or 1 to 12. No concept of absolute number, modal position, regardless of key. This is amazing that we have modern day computer systems that don't do this. They don't see it by relative position. We don't have the 2 dials then to be able to automatically tinker with our music by shifting or transposing automatically and rotating through the modal perspectives, changing the tonic upon rotation. So we can't rotate easily through the different modes, and it lacks mode-based transposition. So in other words, what we should be able to do, see how this song, I can represent this song as being something that's in the Ionian mode. Now notice, as I play, I'm going to have to tell the system, I could tell the system, look, I'm working in the collection of notes of C major or D major or whatever, and then I can assign the tonic. This one I'm going to imagine is in the Ionian, let's say C major, but if I write it this way, then I don't really know what key it's in terms of which collection of notes, because it's all relative. I can then put on top of this any collection of notes. That's the point. But if the Ionian was the tonic, then I can transpose this to any 12 collections of notes automatically without even having to rewrite this. If, in other words, I did this by hand, this is the way I would write modern sheet music, right? You would write it not referring to the note names, but rather to the relative position, naming the chords by relative position, as well as the Nashville numbers representing individual notes for, say, a melody, because then you don't have to rewrite it to change different keys. You just say, no, now we're going to be playing it in the collection of notes of D major. Now E major, this is a G major. I don't need to rewrite anything. So it transposes automatically. The computer can, of course, do that automatically transposition and rewrite it if, at least in the background, it has this information. You could still write it normally, but this would kind of like be in the background. And it should be able to rotate from a modal perspective. So see, this is an Ionian, and this is a 1 for the Ionian. It should be able to rotate it now the Dorian. So if I went from Ionian to the related Dorian, it should just be able to make that rotation automatically. Now, if the Dorian is now it, and it's D Dorian, then the Dorian should be the lowest note in this row, right? This row has the Dorian's the lowest note, the 2 is the lowest note, the 1 is going to be higher in pitch than the 2, right? And then I can go to the Phrygian. So now I have a 3-note Phrygian, which is snapping into place here, which is a minor mode, which will have a minor third instead of a major third for the Ionian. And the 3 is now the lowest note in this collection or in this row. And then I go to the 4. So now the 4, or Lydian, is the lowest note in this collection of notes, and the relative positions are moving up. From a chord stacking standpoint, I should also be able to expand this if I wanted to. This is the same information back to the C major, where the C is the lowest note, and we're building up from here. These are the chords that are stacked, and these are the collection of notes that were represented in a Nashville number. The key over here is that we have the notes. This is all that's in a normal MIDI system, the notes, and then this numbering system, which is the behind the scenes for the computer. But we should have another relative position, meaning the Nashville numbers. See, these Nashville numbers 1 through 7, the 0.5s representing the 5 notes that are outside the collection, which I can make a permanent Nashville number system, meaning they keep on going up, right, and down in pitch, so that they represent octaves. So that means if I rotate this from a C to a D, I can just rotate it on this dial. Now, if I want to rotate it up to a D up here and keep it in a C in a major scale, everything would rotate up here in a relative position. The current systems should be able to do that. You should be able to rotate everything up because they would just shift everything up. But the modal system should be doable as well, meaning I could shift everything up to a D. Now I'm at the D instead of the C, and everything's going up from here. But instead of just having this from a D major perspective, this dial over here is still on the Dorian, meaning it's the related Dorian. It's the related Nashville number 2 to C major's 1. So it's not the same pattern going up, because now it's being mapped out from the Dorian's perspective, the Dorian now being the lowest note. And then if I go to the next one, this could go up to the E. Now, if this 3 over here was the 1, then I would be looking at it from an E major, meaning just transposing the information. But I should be able to shift this dial to say, no, I want to look at the relative 3, which is the Phrygian. So now I'm on E Phrygian. The E is now the lowest note, and all the chords have been adjusted, and the notes have been adjusted to fit into, from this perspective, just rotating everything up. So that's the idea. So basic chords should be modular, not stacked notes. So why can't I just enter a C major 7 or a 1, 3, 5, 7? In other words, when I'm entering information into the system, I would like to not have to stack individual notes, but type it in there by relative Nashville number, or the nodal points, or the actual note chord name, or possibly a chord name that doesn't refer to the C, right? So it would just be an Ionian, a 4-note Ionian chord, right? Because that would be the idea of it. And by doing that, then again, once I type everything into the system, I can reread it, and I can tell if something is a standard chord or if it's not, if I have it in one row layout. So I can read something and say, oh, here's a chord, here's a singular note, here's a note that doesn't fit in a normal chord shape, it's been stacked on top of a chord or something like that. So you must manually input each pitch currently. There's no way to enter the chords. You could maybe have a drop down that enters the chords, but it'll still be entered in a stacked system, so you won't be able to go back and read the chords from a chord perspective. You'll have to be able to see the stacking and then know what chord that is. So there's no modular logic layout, no easy way to apply a chord shape. So again, what I'd like to be able to say is condense this down to one row so that I can see the chords. In other words, whether I write it in a stacked format, 12 notes per octave, or I condense it down to one row, I should be able to expand it or contract it. When I contract it down to one row, this chord now is recognizable. I could write it as just a C major chord if I was in the collection of notes around the C. So then I can recognize these as chords. Whereas if it's stacked, I can't recognize it as a chord, right? It's going to be a lot harder for most people to see this and say, oh, what kind of chord is that? What is that, right? They might have been able to know when they write it in there, but they're not. But if I'd like it to be able to say, now I can condense it and say, oh, now I can see these are normal chord structures because I can see the chord names. All right. Now, one more thing I just want to point out. You might be saying, what about modern music like jazz or something, which changes modal perspective and the collection of notes all the time? That should also be something that we should be able to do, meaning this part of I might say this part of the song, I'm looking at one chord, one set of notes, or looking at it from one perspective of the collection of notes, and one modal perspective like the Ionian. And this collection might be the same collection of notes, but maybe I'm looking at it from the perspective of the Dorian. And this part might be in a whole different collection of notes in like the Lydian or something like that. I should be able to assign a collection of notes as well as a modal perspective to each piece of the song, which then allows me to rotate the entire song, transpose it, the entire thing, and or look at each section and transpose it or rotate it through all the modal perspectives, kind of like a Rubik's Cube, but in such a way that makes musical sense. The ability to tinker then with the song in a way that makes musical sense, going up massively. That's how it's designed to work. That's how we should be able to tinker with things in a DAW system these days.